Hello, welcome to the Natural Fails channel, and today we are going to be talking about something very near and dear to my heart. That is Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Recently, there's been a lot of news in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition community about a remaster. This remaster was created because of an OGL scandal that happened during the start of 2023 when Wizards of the Coast decided that they were going to update the wording of their open game license. Without getting into the nitty gritty of that, because that would necessitate an entirely new video, if I'm to be honest, it's such a large concept. It made it so that anyone who was publishing under the OGL for profit would have a harder time monetizing, and Wizards of the Coast would basically have the right to steal their content, sort of, depending on how you read the document. It was not a great document that got leaked. But because of the threat of these OGL changes, Paizo came together with many other publishing companies to create the ORC license. The ORC license, or the Open RPG Creative license, was made by Paizo to prevent such a reversal, if you would, from happening again. Instead of one major company having a hold of this license and being able to change the wording if they ever saw necessary, they gave it to a third party lawyer group who will make sure that nobody can come in and change the wording unless it is absolutely necessary, and to maintain that it will be able to serve everyone who publishes under it. However, that left Paizo in a bit of a weird spot as their newest game system, Pathfinder 2nd Edition, had been released under the OGL. So, Paizo decided to make the decision to remaster 2nd Edition. This remaster is mostly just changing names to different things. That way, they cannot be sued for not using the OGL. This also means that many legacy abilities or names or items are either going to be renamed or completely reworked, or in some cases, just straight out removed. Some example of some name changes that I think are a overall just a benefit for giving Pathfinder its own identity that is separate from D&D. The first is, instead of calling spell levels, they are now spell ranks, which will help with the confusion that many players had when it comes to what is a level, right? You have spell levels, then you have normal levels. Spell levels only go up to level 10, but normal levels go up to level 20, right? That was really confusing. Next, they changed the condition flat foot to off guard. While I don't think this necessarily has anything to do with moving away from OGL, I think this was more of a change to help to clarify what being flat-footed means mechanically. See, if you're flat-footed in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, that means you have a -2 to your AC, and flat-foot for new players doesn't really feel like that means you're getting a -2 penalty to your AC. So they changed the wording to off guard to better capture this idea of being off guard. Therefore, you are easier to hit because your attention is elsewhere, depending on however you have gained that flat foot condition. Some other changes is negative damage is now void damage, positive is now vitality. Attack of opportunity is now called reactive strike, and I actually really like this change because you use your reaction to strike. I think it makes a lot more sense. There's also examples of them making an action less wordy. For example, sustain a spell slash activation is now just called sustain. You are sustaining an effect. You don't need to say, I'm sustaining a spell, I'm sustaining an activation. You are just doing the action sustain. And some more of those legacy changes are going to be things like Scorching Ray is now Blazing Bolt, Meteor Swarm is now Falling Stars, and Mage Hand is now Telekinetic Hand. Now, at first, it might seem like this remaster is just changing some names, and honestly, if that were it, there wouldn't be a whole lot point to make this video. However, Paizo decided that now would be a great time for them to sort of look over the core rulebook, the advanced player guide, the bestiary, and the game master guide, and decide how can we fix this system to make it just work a little bit better. So they made a number of what are functionally erratas to the original Pathfinder 2nd Edition, and add these new cool little changes. So, today we are going to be covering some of my favorite changes and the changes that I think will be the most important for you to keep in mind when you roll up to play Pathfinder 2nd Edition going forward. So, the first big change that Paizo made was removing alignment. Alignment has been in D&D specifically ever since its inception. At first, sort of being this linear line from lawful to chaotic, it then adds a second axis, so the axis of good and evil, in the basic set. So, because this is so heavily tied to D&D and the D&D legacy, this had to go. So, instead of alignment, they decided to add edicts and anathemas. Basically, the things that your character believes in and the things that your characters are against. This is something that's completely just written out by the player and has no mechanical implications in the game. I think this is a really beneficial change for Pathfinder 2nd Edition in particular, especially since alignment would always sort of bring up these arguments. Oh, I don't think your definition of good matches my definition of good, so I'm going to make that a problem at the table. I've seen this happen multiple times. In fact, once a long time ago, I had a player who would constantly challenge another player whether or not his actions fit in with a lawful good character. It ended up creating a lot of friction for no reason since these alignments were so person specific. It is hard to put something as complex as a moral compass into any one sort of set definition. So, edicts and anathema. I love it. It's a great change. It also gets rid of that mechanical implication where being a neutral character was mechanically the superior choice because you'd be unaffected by all alignment damage. So, I think it's a very great change that we got here going on. Now, we cannot talk about alignment being removed without talking about alignment damage being removed and what they decided to replace that with, and that is going to be spirit damage. Spirit damage is basically the catch all for anything that used to be alignment damage. The cool thing about this is now the alignment damage is no longer going to not affect people of that alignment. It will now affect anyone who has a soul. Spirit damage just directly harms the soul and even has a very interesting niche use where if let's say a ghost or another person is controlling or possessing another creature, you can say to your DM, I choose to attack the person who is doing the possessing. I am not going to harm the soul of the person who is being possessed. I think this is a fantastic change and basically a secret divine caster buff. Divine casters were notoriously weak because a lot of their damage spells were alignment damage. And you wouldn't know if that alignment damage would work until you actually used it. So now you just have spirit damage. I think this is a great change. I love it a lot. The next change. This one's small, but is removing ability scores. These ability scores have been removed in its entirety, and in its place is just ability modifiers. So instead of having a strength of 14, which is a +2 modifier, you just have the +2 strength. I like this change, mainly because ability scores were not doing anything in Pathfinder 2nd Edition. No mechanics really interacted with them. They were just sort of there out of legacy because of D&D. It was a sacred cow. But now that sacred cow is gone. The only hiccup I see with this is that once you got a stat to 18, or in this case now a +4, you used to be able to give it a boost during your ability boost, which you would get at level 5, 10, 15, and 20, to make that stat 19, which wouldn't have a buff, but it was a visual reminder that, hey, I boosted this stat. The next time I boost it, it will go to 20, and then I'll get that +5. However, how Paizo decided to deal with this is on the character sheet, there is now a box for ability boost, and you just check that off, and you know the next time that you get a boost at, let's say, level 10, you'll be able to make that a +5 modifier for whichever stat you have. Is it the most elegant solution? It's debatable, but I think it works, and overall, I think this is a great change, since let's be honest, ability scores didn't really matter. The next thing, instead of being a removement or replacing to something, we now have a buff. Disarm was notoriously one of the weakest combat maneuvers that you could pull off. Basically, all that it gave was a -2 to attack and a essentially a +2 to attempt to disarm again until the creature's start of their turn. So that -2 to attack that you gave it would functionally not matter unless they had a attack of opportunity. However, now that -2 to attack lasts until the target of this attack spins an interact action to re-grip their weapon. This is a fantastic change and puts this maneuver on about the same level as the trip action. And I actually really like how this meshes with the trip action. Trip being this offensive action that gives a -2 to AC, and disarm being sort of the defensive action, right? Giving a -2 to hit, depending on whatever situation you want. And in both cases, the target, the monster, has to spend an action to get rid of the debuff. And if I remember correctly, both of these trigger reactive strikes, meaning that if they decide to do this action, if you have a fighter or someone who took the reactive strike feat, bam, you're getting extra damage on top of this. I think this makes it a great strategic choice. And along with that, they've also added a couple of new feats for fighters and rogues. Rogues, especially, getting this new feat at, I believe it was level 6, that allows them to use acrobatics instead of athletics. I think it is called slide disarm. This is just a really great change. We love to see buffs. And now, if you want to play a disarming character who's all about weaving in and out, taking the weapons out of their enemies' hands, it's a viable build now. Great change. The next change is, while the last one was a buff to a strength based maneuver, this is an entirely new strength based maneuver called Reposition. The reposition action allows the user to move the target 5 feet within reach on a success or 10 feet on a crit. This is very, very similar to the shove, which would shove someone away 5 or 10 feet. And I really like how this reposition ability is going to interact with shove. Now, you and your table mates can go around really controlling the placement of enemies and being able, if you need to shove them or if you need to reposition them, get a monster into a weak spot. That way, you and your allies can take advantage of things like flanking, or if someone gets the snare options, which are going to be in player core 2, you can move someone into the snare, fixing one of the weaknesses of snares so that monsters wouldn't willingly walk into that space. Now you can just reposition them into it. I love this change. Anything to make the game more strategic is good in my book. Speaking of changing things and more strategic options, there are now new uses for interact actions. A single use of interact action can now swap a held item for another in your pack. This very small change could change how Pathfinder 2nd Edition is played. Now, it is completely possible to play a switch hitter build where you are switching with a single action between a melee or ranged, right? So you can put your short sword away and pull out a short bow to aim and fire at an enemy away from you that you can't get to or is running away. Dex characters, especially, are eating good since they will use the same stat for both of these weapons. I love this change. This is going to have very interesting implications when it comes to how do you balance having two hands. I really love this. Keep an eye out for it and make sure that you don't forget to put your sword away and pull out a healing potion for your downed cleric. They'll thank you for that. This next change I am very, very excited for. As someone who always plays spellcasters in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, I am so happy to announce that they have changed the way focus points work. Before, what would happen is that you could have up to
3 points in a focus pool. If you were to use 2 focus points in a single fight, you could only regain a singular focus point until you had spent more focus points, meaning these effectively per battle abilities didn't really feel per battle. You wouldn't be able to have a lot, and you had to take 2 feats, one at level 12, one at level 18, to be able to regain all 3 focus points back to get your focus pool all the way back up to full. Thankfully, Paizo has changed how this works. Now, instead, you can simply regain 1 focus point for every 10 minutes you spend focusing. A fantastic change. This means that you can go ham on all these focus spells and just get them right back again. Basically, any class that has a good focus point spell is going to be eating well. And I, for one, am so excited about this change. Another change to spellcasters, which was not as well received, is the cantrip damage change. So, a little bit of backstory. When Rage of Elements was released, the Pathfinder 2nd edition was excited sort of to see, the first glimpses of what would this remaster look like. And one thing that many players noticed immediately was they changed the way that cantrips, how their damage formula was set up. Originally, cantrips did usually 1d4 plus mod damage or 1d6 plus mod damage. Instead, they now do 2d4 no mod damage and 2d6 no mod damage. Basically, this was to make cantrips more in line with other focus spells or leveled, ranked, in this case, spells. As in, none of those spells ever added mods, so cantrips were just sort of this weird black sheep that got to add modifier damage. Why is this a big deal? Well, because for some cantrips that mean about a zero 0.5 to a point less average damage. It doesn't seem like a lot. However, to many people in the 2E Reddit who already did not like the way that spellcasters felt to play, especially those who wanted spellcasters to do competent damage, were outraged by this change. And in fact, this very small change caused a several month debate over whether or not spellcasters had gotten worse or if they were just unusable. Needless to say, my opinion is that this change doesn't really matter. Cantrips, in exchange for losing these a point of damage, usually all of them got a very special niche, a special thing that they do differently from all other cantrips. An example would be the Produce Flame cantrip, which is now called the Ignition cantrip, was always supposed to be the cantrip that you could use in melee. So, to strengthen that flavor, Produce Flame went from doing 1d4 mod damage to Ignition doing 2d4 damage. But if you were to use Ignition in melee, it now does 2d6, incentivizing you to go run up in melee and have a wizard punch a dude. Awesome. Plus, we love a good fire punch reference here. I really like this. This makes Ignition now a cantrip people will choose if they feel like they need it. That versatility of being able to go from ranged to melee and having a noticeable benefit is something that I love. And most other cantrips got something similar to this. For example, Ray of Frost, which is now changed to Frostbite, is no longer a spell attack. It is now a fortitude save. And this is great, especially for some classes who didn't really have a good cantrip to target fortitude. Now, for those fights where you are fighting that scrawny wizard in the back, you can just do a frostbite, target their lowest save, and be pulling in some okay damage. So, I like this change. I know some people don't, but I think you got to take it with what it is, and I think this is overall going to be a benefit to most spellcasters in the long run. Another change that I am particularly excited about as a spellcaster main, if you would, is the move away from classes being trained in specific spell lists. So, if you're going to notice in the pre remaster classes,
A class like the wizard would be trained specifically in arcane spells. However, now if you look at the same wizard in the remastered second edition, you're going to notice that they are just trained in spell casting. So this means that if you were to take a multi-class dedication, or really any dedication that would give you access to a different type of spell list, you can cast those spells just as effectively as your arcane wizard spells. The only exception is that maybe the key stat that you are using for it might be different. So, for example, if you really wanted to game the system, you could play a wizard with the new remastered witch dedication. That way, you can get a wizard who can have access to arcane or any of the other three spell lists. And because witch and wizard are both int casters, that means that wizard would be using the same save DCs or to hit for spell attack rolls between both of the traditions. So that means that this wizard could just as effectively cast divine spells that they got from taking the witch dedication. I love this change because before the remaster, it could feel very hard and limiting to find a good multi-class dedication for a spellcasting class. I especially felt this as my table in particular almost always uses the free archetype variant rule. So this is just a massive buff because sometimes, a lot of those dedications you're taking to help improve a certain fighting style if you're playing a martial. And now, if you're a spellcaster, you can take certain dedications to help improve your flexibility as a spellcaster. I love this change. This is fantastic. I think it brings a cohesion to the spellcasters that were simply not there before. And I am so excited to get to play around with these new rules and come up with some new character ideas. However, this next change, I can't even call it change, can I? It is more of a clarification of a rule that was so badly written in the core rulebook that the majority of the Pathfinder 2nd Edition Reddit community gaslit themselves into playing this rule incorrectly for years, and I can say I was one of those people. This is a clarification to the Dying Wounded rules. I am going to throw up a little poll that was taken a few months ago, maybe a month ago at this point in the Reddit community, that basically asked how people ran the Dying Wounded rules. It turns out that there were some confusing wording depending on where you read these rules that made very different interpretation. The interpretation that you're going to see was the most popular on screen, voted by 1.2 thousand people, was that the wounded condition was only added when you were knocked out. So that means if you were wounded 1 and you were knocked out, you would be dying 1 plus wounded 1, so you would start out as dying 2. However, the remaster clarifies these rules on what was intended to be the effect. It is now wounded is added to your dying condition every time it ticks up. So, in practice, let's once again say that you are a wounded character at the moment. You go down, you are wounded 1 plus 1, dying 2, and then let's say you fail that DC 12 check, you are now dead as your dying increases by 2 because you were wounded 1. This makes the game a higher lethality than it was before. At least the very presence of snowballing, going down once or twice, is now a death sentence to any character. And this is going to change the meta if your table decides to play correctly. Whether or not you have to run with this rule, that's up to your table. I talked with my table, and the overwhelming consensus was that we wanted to play as close to the original rules as possible. We were going to take this new rules, and we were going to see if we liked it or not. So maybe one day down the line, I'll be able to come on this channel and tell you, so this is how the
correct dying wounded rules impacted my table, and whether or not I can give a better justification one way or the other for you guys. But I'm going to wait until I can play test those rules, or not really play test, but play how the game was always supposed to be played, and see how that goes for my table. Clearly, this is an issue that has sort of sparked some debates on the 2E community, and I think if you decide to take the rules or you decide to run as how most people were running them before, that's that's up to you and your table. Just do what your table has fun. My table, I have players who love high lethality, love the chance of their characters dying, and then I have other players who don't, and I know people who would prefer whatever character they start out with, hopefully be the character they end the game with. So this is going to depend on your table. Again, do what's going to allow you to have the most fun. Well, with that, we have talked about many of the largest changes that are going to be happening in the Pathfinder 2nd Edition remaster. And I want to clarify here, I know I spent some, I don't know, 20, 30 minutes talking about how the system was going to change. In large strokes, this is going to be the same Pathfinder 2nd Edition that the community has grown to love over the last 4-ish years. While there might be some changes here and there, this is still Pathfinder 2nd Edition. So if you have any cold feet about being a returning player who doesn't know if this remaster is going to be the same game, I will basically give it my natural fail stamp of approval. At worst, this is 2.1. This isn't even nearly as big as a jump as D&D 3rd Edition to D&D 3.5. With that in mind, thank you for listening to me talk about these changes. Let me know in the comments how you feel about these changes, or if there are some changes that I failed to bring up in this video that you think are going to be important, or something that you're looking forward to in the remaster once everyone gets their hands on that book in a few weeks. Until then, try to avoid natural fails, and I'll see you next time. Oh, and if you would like to subscribe or leave a like, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you. Y'all have a good rest of your day.